My name is Katie Neimeyer. I'm a genetic counselor at Fred Hutch Cancer Center. A very common question that I get is, what is a genetic counselor? And genetic counselors are a type of healthcare provider that help people understand their genetics and how their genetics may impact their health and their health risks. I don't think it has always been a clear path for me to become a genetic counselor. I would say growing up, I did tend to gravitate towards science and math. I really liked that you could have certain types of equations that would help you get to an answer, and that there were different ways to get to that answer. And so there was something about that that really intrigued me. I didn't always find math and science to be easy. Oftentimes I found it to be quite difficult. But what's funny is now I work in genetics, which is within the field of biology. So it's funny to me that it was a very difficult subject to me, and yet here I am working in the field of biology. Biology is the study of life, and genetics is specifically interested in the building blocks, how those building blocks are made for life. And I think one of the things that maybe led me to this career is I've always really liked talking to people. When I was in high school, my first job was working as a host at a restaurant. And from that experience, I learned that I really liked interacting with people one-on-one. And so I started to think, maybe I want to become a doctor or some type of nurse practitioner or some type of healthcare provider, because you get to speak with people one-on-one. And then after college, I worked as a clinical research coordinator. And that's actually where I learned about genetic counseling. I worked with a genetic counselor on that research study. I loved that genetic counselors worked with people one-on-one and got to have really in-depth conversations. But then they also use really interesting science and genetics to be able to help people. So that's really what I loved most about it. I don't know if I initially would consider myself a scientist, specifically just because I don't work in research. I primarily identify as a healthcare provider because that's really what my job is. I provide care to patients, but I use science and genetics every day in my job. And science is about being curious. It's about observing and observation. It's about gathering information and testing a hypothesis and learning from that. And in my job, I gather information about a patient and their medical history and their family history. And I ask the question, is there something genetic causing health issues in the family? And then we do testing to help answer that question. So in that way, I do identify as a scientist. So right now, I work as an oncology genetic counselor at Fred Hutch Cancer Center. What that means is I meet with patients that might be sick with cancer or with people who want to understand why cancer might run in their families. Sometimes people get sick with cancer because of something that's different in their genes. And we all have these genes, which are basically instructions that tell our bodies how to protect ourselves from cancer. And sometimes those instructions can be written incorrectly. It's not very common for that to be the case and for that to be the cause of cancer. But if we do find those mistakes in somebody's genetics, it can be really helpful because it can help their doctors make them healthier or keep them healthy. And I like to compare what I do to being a detective. I look for patterns and I look for clues in people's family histories. I ask them a lot of questions about what their family members have been sick with, and then I try to help them find an answer. What I think is especially cool about genetic counseling is there are lots of different types of genetic counselors, and there's no one right way to be a genetic counselor. In general, though, I do think it's important for genetic counselors to be good at observing and listening. It's really important for that detective work that we all do. So something I find really exciting about being in the field of genetic counseling is that we are learning new things all the time. What's coming out in the research? What are some new medications maybe that we can use for patients with genetic mutations? Which just means that those people have a genetic change in one of their genes that makes the gene maybe not work the way that it's supposed to be. Something difficult about my work is I sometimes work with very sick people, and that can be really hard to see. But I like the opportunity that I get to be able to connect with those people when they're going through a really hard time. It can be very challenging, but it's also one of the most rewarding parts of my job is that I get to connect with people during those hard times. And now I'm going to answer some questions from some students on a recent field trip to Pacific Science Center. Martin in the 3rd grade asks, How do patterns help you do your job? And I love this question so much. Understanding genetic inheritance patterns is really key for being a genetic counselor. We all have these different traits and characteristics and different, health conditions. Potentially all people and all families have these in their genes, and they are passed on in specific patterns. We all have about 20,000 genes that make up our bodies. And these genes provide those instructions for our bodies, and they tell our bodies what to do, how to differentiate the nose from the toe. And each of our parents pass down 50% of their genetics to us. So I have inherited 50% of my genetics from my mom, and I've inherited 50% of my genetics from my dad. But each gene has a different purpose, and each gene is inherited in a different way. There are lots of different ways that those genes can be inherited, lots of different patterns that those genes can be inherited in. Madison in the 4th grade asks, why does cancer make people so sick? Does everyone get sick in the same way? That's a great question. Cancer is a disease of the cells. And our body is made up of millions of different cells. And our cells, they often replicate or make copies of themselves. They do this all the time. And sometimes when they divide and make copies, they can make mistakes. And that can make people very sick because it can make it so that maybe their organs aren't working the way that they're supposed to. And cancer can happen in any part of the body. And because of that, cancer is not just one disease. It's many different types of diseases. That's why things can look so different from person to person who has a cancer diagnosis. Rhea in the 4th grade asks, are you making medicine for cancer? I don't make medicine for cancer. However, the work that I do, when we do genetic testing, sometimes I'll help the patient understand if they have one of those genetic mutations. And knowing if they have a genetic mutation can help us understand what types of medicines might work better for them if they have cancer. Liliana in the 3rd grade asks, do you work at a hospital? I specifically work in a clinic, which means that I meet with patients who come to me with specific questions within the specialty of cancer genetics versus a traditional hospital that might be seeing lots of different patients with lots of different types of medical needs. Where I work at Fred Hutch, we collaborate with lots of different hospitals and doctors within our community. If there was one thing that I were to say to somebody who is interested in this field, I would say, yes, go for it. Genetics and genetic counseling is a very exciting field to be in right now. It's very new and it's growing very fast. If you like science and genetics, and if you also like talking to people one-on-one, it can be a very wonderful career path to choose. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn about genetics and genetic counseling. If you'd like to learn more, check out the link in the description. Until next time, stay curious.